first coffee club of this year. It's great to see you all. Yeah, just a couple of sort of little minor housekeeping points. We will be recording this session. We record it for the CPD accreditation. So after we finish today's session, we'll send it off to CPD. And then within the next around about the next 3 to 4 weeks, you will all receive a CPD certificate acknowledging that you've taken part in today's session. So the coffee club is a round table. So it's intended to be a discussion group. So as we get into the subject today, we'll be asking you guys for your opinions, observations, comments, and so on. And John, our expert, who I'll introduce more formally shortly, John is here to answer your questions and share his vast experience in this area. Okay, so if you have any questions, please either put your hand up and we'll come to you as we're going along, or if you want to put something in the chat, put your comments in the chat as well, so we can see them here, and then we'll we'll relay the chat comments and maybe even come back to you as well and ask you to expand on what it is you put in there. So okay, so we're glad to be back, and just before we kick off, just a couple of quick thank yous. I want to say thanks to David Wilner, my colleague David Wilner, for actually reaching out to Trade Technologies and to really kind of kicking off where we are this morning. To Esther and to Sadia for actually organizing everything, pulling it all together. So thanks to you guys. To our technical team, who are here to my left, who make it all look pretty amazing. Hannah representing High Radius, and of course our resident expert John Walden today. Okay, all right then. So I think we can get started. So we'll just move forward then. John, this is your moment just to tell us a little bit about yourself. So everybody, I want to welcome John Walden this morning. So John, if you want to tell us a wee bit about yourself, and off we go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, and thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be with you all this morning. And what could be better at breakfast time than talking about Incoterms? So my background's been in international trade. Like many people, I think I kind of walked into it by accident when I left university, and I've been there ever since. I've written a few books about international trade. I think 3 books now. Every time I've written one, I've always said I won't do another one, but then I've done another one, but I don't think I'll be doing any more. I am an accredited Incoterms trainer. Now you have to be doing an exam to legally teach Incoterms. So I should tell you that I am an accredited trainer in Incoterms, and I have been involved in the last 3 reviews of Incoterms, 2000, 2010 and 2020. And again, after each review, I've always said, I'm never going to do that again. And I've always found myself doing it again. So we'll see what happens in 2030 when the next review would take place. I'm heavily involved in the Institute of Export and International Trade. I'm an examiner for them and one of their tutors. So that keeps me busy as well. And I also do work for various organizations, including UNC, National Chamber of Commerce, UNCTAD. And that's me really. So very happy to be with you all this morning.
Okay, and then just to prove that you're legit, there's your certificate, right? So
yeah, strangely we have to show. So yeah.
Okay. Just to touch on that before we go on to the next bit, I say in our accreditation program, our certificate program, we actually make reference to the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce. So I just thought, and it's kind of reassuring to see that they really exist, and there it is. And obviously,
they do indeed.
They do indeed. Is it US based or European based?
No, it's not actually. Their headquarters is in Paris. But I mean, most countries do have a chapter of the ICC actually in country. But yeah, headquarters in Paris.
Okay, so we'll move forward now. So I say we really pleased to be doing this today because I know when we floated the idea and we first put the promotion out about talking about Incoterms, a lot of people working in order to cash kind of say, well, that's we're asking the question really, like, what's that got to do with me, right? And as I gone through my career and yeah, we realized that actually Incoterms actually affect all of us, and not only just on the sales side. It's also very relevant to the P2P, accounts payable. So really every aspect of business in terms of, I guess, moving products into your organization and then selling them at the other side. Incoterms pop up at pretty well every step of the way. So it's something that's kind of is there that we don't always necessarily see it ourselves. So getting to this point today, so we're very pleased that John is one of the key trainers of this company called Trade Technologies. So if you just wanted to give us a brief background on who they are, John, and then we'll crack on.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks very much for the kind introduction. So everyone, hello. If you haven't heard of Trade Technologies, and you may not have heard of us before, we're the leader of trade documentation software and services. There's a slide here which shows you our services and our company. And as you can see, we offer software as a service, TradeSharp, which is our system. It's a fantastic tool to create documentation and accurately, to prepare the documentation accurately and to present documents to banks online, which saves valuable time and courier costs. Of course, makes it very good for the environment, apart from anything else. We also provide outsourcing solutions to assist exporters if they don't have their own manpower. We have 16 offices. We're very well equipped to support and bring expertise worldwide, wherever you are in the world. And of course, in a globalized international trading environment, that really matters. We handle the whole process from reviewing drafts, presenting compliant documents to the bank, ensuring exporters receive their payments promptly in a timely manner, which is, of course, crucial to cash. If you want to know more about Trade Technologies, or you would like to see a demo, please do contact Christine, who'll be very happy to help. You can see her contact details at the bottom of the slide. So that was a little bit about us, about Trade Technologies. So now let's start talking a little bit about Incoterms. I'm going to start off with just a few slides, which I'm going to go through fairly quickly, if I may. So the next slide, please. I guess while we're, probably the best introduction to this is to say that in any international trade transaction, there are 4 pillars. And those pillars are, we always refer to them as commercial, transport, regulatory, and finance. And in any international trade transaction, of course, as you know, you're going to get those 4 things. There's going to be commercial decisions, there's going to be contracting, the goods have got to move, so there's going to be transport, there are legal regulatory requirements, customs, safety, security, dangerous goods, and so on. And of course, there's finance. And all of those are interconnected with each other. If you take anyone out, you haven't got a transaction. And the weakness is often when there aren't good links between those 4 pillars. Incoterms helps provide, if you like, the glue to cement those 4 pillars together. And as you can see on the slide at the moment, even in the most simple transaction, you've got several, if you like, critical points. And if you look at that slide, at every one of those critical points, you can see 12 of them. There are often more than 12, sometimes there can be less, but generally there's going to be a minimum of 10 to 12. Now, at every one of those points, there's going to be an activity, there's going to be cost, there's going to be a risk, and there's going to be a responsibility. And this really underlines what Incoterms do. The best way, to remember it is by the acronym DROC: delivery, risk, obligation, cost. That's exactly what Incoterms do. They tell us where legal and physical delivery takes place, and legal and physical can be 2 different places. It tells us where risk passes from the seller to the buyer, It tells us obligation, who's got to do what, and very importantly, cost. It tells us who's going to pay for all those different activities that you get in international supply chains. Next slide, please. So in all, we have 11 Incoterms. And those terms, one of the things I mentioned a couple of minutes ago was the whole thing about risk. And I can't see the next slide yet, but I'm sure it's going to come up in a minute. Because if you look at the point of risk transfer, that's a very, very important element. Sorry, you need to click one more. There should be D terms as well. And then the last bit of that slide. There we go. So what you can see there is for the 4 groups of terms, and we divide Incoterms into 4 groups designated by the first letter of the term: E group, F group, C group, and D group. And I think what's interesting is that in the E group, F group, and C group terms, the risk passes from the seller to the buyer. Sorry, can you go back one slide, please? From the seller to the buyer in the country of dispatch. Okay, and sorry, the slide's gone now. But in the D group terms, what you see is risk passes from seller to buyer in the country of arrival. So that's a very, very big difference. E, F, or C, risk passes on dispatch. Sorry, you've gone back a bit too far now. Next.
You want the next one?
This one that's up there now. If you can populate, there. That's it.
Right.
So that's it. Great. So as you can see there, that's a really important point, that with 8 of the 11 terms, risk passes on dispatch. Even if the seller is using a C term and has to get the goods to an arrival point, the risk still passes on dispatch, not on arrival. It's only with the D group terms, DAP, DPU, DDP, that risk passes from seller to buyer on arrival of the goods. So from an exporter's point of view, using those terms can be extremely dangerous, because if the goods never arrive, then the seller is never entitled to get paid. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm sure that's going to generate some discussion in a couple of minutes. In all, there are 11 Incoterms, as I've mentioned. The next slide, I think, there we go. Now, the terms you can see at the moment, they can be used for any mode of transport, for air freight, for road freight, for rail freight, and for containerized sea freight, or for multimodal, for a mixture of those. Next slide, please. The other 4 terms, which you'll see on the slide in a minute, FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF, those 4 can only be used for bulk sea freight. They cannot be used for road, they cannot be used for air, they cannot be used for rail, and they cannot be used for the bulk, no, sorry, that's the wrong terminology. They can't be used for most sea freight transactions, because most sea freight transactions nowadays, goods are in containers. And you can't use those 4 terms when goods are loaded into 20-foot or 40-foot or any type of container. It doesn't work. And that's quite a big problem globally, because what we do see globally is people are still using CIF, FOB, CFR when the goods are in containers. You can't do that. It's a very, very big problem. Next slide, please. So
that's all we got, John. That's it.
Okay. Sorry. I think the last slide was probably a thank you slide, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
But that's fine. So those are key things. So Mark, if I may, just a few things to generate, which I hope will also generate some discussion. Before we open the floor. Incoterms do link with payments. It's quite interesting, because if you look at the Incoterms 2020 book, for the first time, there is actually a page on what Incoterms don't do. It's an innovation. It's an innovation in Incoterms, what they don't do. And of course, one of the things they don't do is they don't dictate the method, term, or currency of payment. They don't do that. They can't do that. but they do link with payment. For example, you can't use D Incoterms if a letter of credit is the method of payment. It doesn't work. And if anyone wants to explore that, we can do that in a minute, but it doesn't work. Also, even though it's not a requirement of Incoterms, and it's not inherent in Incoterms, many organizations nowadays do use the point at which risk transfers under an Incoterm as the point of revenue recognition. Now, there's nothing to say that you have to do that, but more and more and more organizations are doing that. And that's quite an interesting innovation, I think. The last thing I want to say before we open up, if I may, is that there's a real danger nowadays in using an inappropriate term. And sometimes people say to me, okay, the goods are packed in containers. Of course they are. We ship goods in containers, but we use CIF. Does it really matter? Well, more and more now, what we're hearing is insurance companies are saying, we're not going to pay. If that's the case, if an organization, if a contract is under the wrong term, that it says CIF, the goods are in containers, and there's an insurance claim, we're not going to pay, because the contracting parties, they've used a completely inappropriate Incoterm, and that nullifies the insurance. Now, that's something that we started seeing fairly recently now, but it does underline the importance of using an appropriate term. So, Mark, let me stop there.
No, that's a good introduction. Thank you. And I've got quite a few. Does any I got quite a few questions here to ask you, John. Does anybody else have any questions they want to raise or ask before I jump into some of mine? All right, I'll be back. Okay, all right. John, most of the people that are with us today primarily work for, should we say, manufacturing companies, or they produce products as opposed to services, and a lot of these products are originating in the Far East, and then coming through to Europe and then being assembled and so on, and then maybe being exported elsewhere. Does every shipment have an Incoterm?
Yes, it does. I think an important thing to remember is that an Incoterm is specific to a contract. You can't have more than one Incoterm in one contract. And I think the point to underline there, and it's always important to remember this, is that the Incoterm governs the contract of sale. It doesn't govern the contract of carriage. And, there's often confusion here, Mark, because what we see very often is freight forwarders, quite regularly actually, they say to their customers, okay, we will deliver the goods up to CIP New York. And that's a very dangerous thing to say, because the freight forwarder isn't saying, well, we're going to take the risk up to New York, we're going to take the obligation, the responsibility, the cost. All they're saying is we'll move the goods to New York, notwithstanding what the Incoterm is. So yeah, so in the terminology governing a shipment, the way I would rather phrase that would be the Incoterm governs the contract rather than the individual shipment within the contract.
Okay. One of the things we talk about in our our training, well, first of all, so we were asking everybody what they think the most common Incoterm is. In your opinion or your experience, what is the most common Incoterm? It's probably one of those that said it depends, right? But just generally.
Well, no, I can tell you. The most common one, actually, normally, I always, when I'm giving an if you like, an Incoterms lesson or any lesson on international, I always say to the audience, just shout out the ones you know. How many do you know? And everyone shouts out CIF. And that's probably the one that, simply because most people involved in international trade are not shipping bulk goods. They're not shipping, I don't know, 50,000 litres of oil or 10,000 tons of coal. They're shipping containerized cargoes, and you can't use CIF for containerized cargoes. So I think, yeah, CIF is probably the most commonly used one, but it's also the most commonly misused one. I think that's fair to say. And it's actually not helped by the fact that, if we talk about payment methods like letters of credit, many banks in many countries are still opening Incoterms on a CIF, sorry, opening letters of credit, showing the Incoterm as CIF when the goods are in containers, and it should be CIP. So, the problem lingers. The problem really does linger, which is unfortunate.
What so CIF stands for cargo insurance and
Cost insurance and freight.
cost insurance and freight. And what does that mean in reality then? So the cost of insurance and freight of, is it the shipping or the product or everything together?
Yeah. It's the cost of the goods, the cost of the transit insurance up to the arrival point, and the cost of the bulk sea freight up to a port of arrival. CIF has very, very limited, if you like the modern terms like CIP, FCA, they're much, much more flexible. But CIF is one of the original 1936 Incoterms, before containers were even thought about. So it's very old-fashioned, and it's designed only for bulk freight. So it's very, very limited in the way you can use it. But yeah, so as I say, it's the cost of the goods plus the insurance plus the cost of the sea freight up to port of arrival, not discharged.
And do they apply only for international movements or domestic as well? Generally speaking.
Interesting question. Incoterms actually stands for International Commercial Terms. However, domestic trade, and that's something quite new. In the past, the guidance has only been, in reason for that, was try and get the Americans to use them properly. So in 2010, the wording was tweaked to make Incoterms work for domestic trade as well as international trade. You can't use all the terms for domestic trade, but you can use some of them. Having said that, it's actually, it's still fairly unusual to use Incoterms for domestic trade.
Okay, one of the things we we talk about at our training, and then kind of correlating to business to business, buying and selling and getting paid. We talk a little bit about terms and conditions, and the one kind of Incoterm that we sort of focus on is Ex Works, right? So in kind of regular, should we say, lorry-based shipments around Europe, would that be a fairly typical term that applies to most terms and conditions?
Yeah, well, what I would say to that, Mark, is Ex Works is no longer recommended for international trade, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But having said that, if it's within the European Union, the EU being a customs union, it can actually work within the EU. But outside the EU, if you're selling from within the EU to outside, then it can't work. The reason for that is Ex Works is one of the two extreme Incoterms. DDP is the other extreme. But with Ex Works, you have this weird situation where the buyer is actually the exporter of record from a customs perspective, because the buyer has to do not only their own import declaration, they have to do the export declaration from the country of supply as well.
Because Ex Works means, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so we have this weird situation that if I'm a buyer and I buy from you Ex Works, not only do I have to do my import declaration, but I also have to do the export declaration as well. And that means with an Ex Works contract, if you like, the seller is not exporting, they're selling the goods domestically. And because they're doing that, they have to charge VAT, because it's not an export. So that's why, if you look at Incoterms 2020, there's a big, if you like, a health warning with Ex Works saying not recommended for international trade.
Okay, it's a bit more complicated than we thought, isn't it? Which is good.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about, so we focus on the Ex Works in the training, and then kind of correlate it to invoice disputes for particularly for late or damaged goods. But let's focus on the late delivery element of it, because Ex Works, I believe, kind of means that the responsibility for the movement of the goods to the buyer starts, basically the seller makes the goods available at their factory, right there, and then the buyer has to come and arrange the transport and the shipping into their, wherever they want the goods to go. So if there's a late delivery claim, in theory there shouldn't be one, right? Because it's all down to the buyer's responsibility. So it's not really on the onus of the seller. Is that a fair observation?
Absolutely, Mark. Absolutely right. Because with Ex Works, the seller doesn't even load the truck that comes to collect the goods. The buyer has to load their own truck. Strange, but that's what Ex Works says.
I think that's a significant point, because I know collectively every majority of people here in collections or associated with, and they will take the dispute from the customer and give it to customer services, check out, and so on. So it's using up resource within the selling company that probably doesn't have to be used. If just say at that point, this is an Ex Works consignment, you need to check it internally. It's not our kind of responsibility. There's no credit note from us, theoretically.
Yeah. And the other thing about Ex Works is that in the contract, if it's an Ex Works contract, it will instruct the buyer, if you like, or it will give the collection dates on which the buyer has to collect. It may say collection between 8th and 10th February. And interestingly, if the buyer hasn't collected by the 10th of February, they take on the risk. So even if the goods are in the seller's warehouse on the 11th, after the 10th, they become the buyer's risk. If the warehouse catches fire and the goods are destroyed, the buyer still has to pay for them.
Yeah, and this is I think that these are all very interesting points and very important points. It's very much about kind of knowing what you do in your own company and knowing your customer, right? And these are quite significant points, because I know there's always a fairly high number of invoice disputes that relate to late or damaged goods. And I'd imagine, I think now, as we're in quite a turbulent time, a number of buyers will be looking for ways to basically slow down their payments. Yeah. So if they can say, oh yeah, you said you would deliver it on the 10th and it was delivered on the 12th or the 14th or whatever, and then then they raise a dispute, that will kind of slow down, potentially that will slow down them paying, right? So it's kind of any angle. Yeah.
And I think the other thing to remember is that in terms of late arrival, that only impacts on the D group Incoterms, DAP, DBU, DPU, and DDP, because on all the other Incoterms, remember, legal delivery is on dispatch, not on arrival. So even if the terms were CIP New York and the goods are shipped from, say, Hamburg, legal delivery is in Hamburg, not in New York. So the goods have been legally delivered in Hamburg. The rationale behind all of that is that the dispatch date can be given fairly accurately. We all know when we're going to dispatch, when we're going to load the container or load the truck, but we can never be sure of the arrival date. Things happen at sea or on the roads or on the railways, sometimes even in the air, not very often in the air. But there can be lots and lots of reasons for delays of cargo. So what we would always say, when we talk about supply chain planning, is to be very cautious about giving an arrival date. All you can give is an estimated date. But one of the key things about Incoterms is, as long as the contract is E group, F group, or C group, legal delivery is on dispatch of the goods, not on arrival of them.
Which is when you're saying about revenue recognition and that kind of thing as well. Yeah, it's at that point.
Exactly.
Okay, that's quite significant.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Just looking at it from a practical point of view, and I'm thinking now kind of in parts of Germany, Amsterdam, Venice, right? Like in Venice, for example, is probably a clear example where pretty well everything is delivered on the canals in Venice, right? I think it's the most amazing spectacle.
Yeah.
How does that correlate with Incoterms?
That would work out fine. I mean, canals are of course in the motorways. And absolutely fine. The terms can be used absolutely in the normal way.
Okay, so there's no distinction there. The fact that it's going to Venice or it's being moved down, from Hamburg to somewhere in Germany on the rivers or so on. No distinction really. It's just
No distinction.
okay,
The terms work well.
okay. All right. I noticed that Jamie Radford was with us. Jamie, you're still with us. So I'd like to know from an AP or a P2P kind of viewpoint how significant it is. Not sure if Jamie's still with us. Well, hopefully he'll come back in a second. Okay. So other questions I've got here then. I think you said it earlier, but just to double check, did you say that there can only be one Incoterm per shipment?
Yeah, that's correct, Mark. Or one Incoterm per contract is probably a better way to put it, to be honest. Yeah, absolutely. You can't have more than one, otherwise the contract would get very, very confused. So there may be a contract backing another contract which could have a different term. So, agents buying from one party and selling to another, they would buy under one term and sell under another term, or they could do that, and that's fairly normal as well.
Okay. And are you seeing an increase in like letters of credit and things like that as to get more comfort around international shipments?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. I've actually just put an article together I don't know if anyone reads a magazine called The Exporter. I've just put an article together about that. For years and years and years, we've been hearing the letter of credit is dead, blockchain will take over, da 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 da. That hasn't happened. And, to be honest, the letter of credit is the only payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer in international trade. No other payment method does that. So, if anyone reads my article, you'll see that my belief, and it's not just me, I think, it's widely acknowledged, is that the letter of credit isn't dead. Actually, the use, I think, I've noticed is increasing. And it's not just because risk increases. It's simply because, as I say, it is the only payment method that protects both the buyer and the seller. Okay. So even in a relatively low risk situation, low sovereign risk, low banking risk, low commercial risk, sometimes the trading partners do say, okay, let's have a letter of credit. It protects us both. I think, one of the issues, linking that with Incoterms, one of the issues really is the problem of banks in some countries not understanding Incoterms, because the other banks, and I've spoken to banks about this, very often they have drop downs when they're opening Incoterms. And sometimes the drop down does give them a choice of all the terms. It will only give them a choice of 3 terms, and it may not be the term that's governing the contract, and that can be an issue. But to answer your question, Mark, no, I think recently the use of LCs has actually been increasing.
Okay, and that's because of the uncertainty in the economic world, I guess, a lot to do with that.
I think it's a lot to do with that, but also I think there is growing realization that it does actually protect both parties. I think, in the past, there's been a view that LCs, are simply there as a payment instrument for the seller. But they're always the buyer. If they open the letter of credit correctly, the buyer is ensuring that the seller only gets paid if the seller presents documents that prove that they, the seller, have performed the sales contract. If they can't present those documents proving they performed the sales contract, they won't get paid and they shouldn't get paid. And the letter of credit also gives the buyer confidence that they get the documents that they need to legally import the goods into their country according to the import regulations of their country. So I think there's a growing, recognition now that the LC, it's not just protection of payment to the seller, it's also protection for the buyer as well. And I think that's pretty important.
Okay, and that's something as in order to cash, something to be aware of, and maybe even something to recommend to our sales teams when they're looking to expand into new business, maybe in new territories, to not do things the way they've done before, but to consider things like letters of credit and things like that. So it's that's how we can add value to the business, offering alternative ideas.
Yeah, I very much think so. I mean, last couple of weeks I've actually been doing teaching in Ghana. In that region, they're getting very excited about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is going to be it's going to make Africa the biggest trading bloc in the world. And interesting. Sorry, just diverting for a couple of minutes, if I may, because I think it's interesting. Last night I attended a webinar from one of my heroes, the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She's a very formidable woman, and she was trade minister twice in Nigeria. Then she became foreign minister in Nigeria. Then she became managing director of the World Bank, and now she leads the World Trade Organization. Remarkable woman, and she was saying that as far as the world is getting very interested in Africa, but she recognised that for the continental free trade area to really take off with full potential, the traders themselves have got to be better at using payment methods like letters of credit and international trade disciplines like Incoterms. And she was very clear that one of the one of the weak points that needs to be strengthened is actually the traders, the importers and exporters' capacity to conduct international trade according to international best practice of Incoterms, and understanding of the letter of credit rules, UCP 600 and so on. So that's quite interesting.
I was going to say, before I forget, the article you made reference to, or indeed any others, if you can send us the links to them, we'll share them with everybody through our app, right? So everybody can have a look after today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I have to say is I've just had a look at mine, and in fact, that's actually going to be published in April, so it'll have to be after publication in April.
Okay, I can see the everybody's coffee is kicking in now. We've got some questions coming up on here. So first question from a good friend of ours, Nicoletta in Budapest. Question is, in case of delivery from Europe to LATAM, what is the main difference between XWorks and FCA Incoterms?
Okay, so if it's an export from Europe, it doesn't matter where it's going. The big difference between XWorks and FCA, well, firstly, let me say that FCA is the better alternative, because remember, if you sell XWorks to outside the European Union, you have to charge VAT, otherwise you're breaching EU customs regulations, because if you sell XWorks, you are not exporting. The buyer is the exporter. So if you sell XWorks, your buyer in Latin America is actually the legal exporter from your country. So that's a big problem. You are not the exporter, you're the supplier. The big difference with FCA is the good alternative, because with FCA, you, the exporter, you would do the export customs declaration, and that makes you the exporter. And also you would load the collecting vehicle. So you get over that problem as well. So FCA is a really good alternative. With FCA, the seller is the legal exporter, but with XWorks, the buyer is the legal exporter. So FCA is the one to go for. Really good question.
Thank you. Good question. Thanks, Nikki. From maybe as an opportunity for you or for us, John, as well, from Brad Morris saying is there a bluffer's guide to letters of credit for those a bit like myself who are not particularly familiar with the nuances of it?
We at Trade Technologies, we would say don't bluff on letters of credit. It's far too dangerous.
Good point. Brad, what's your thinking behind your comment? And do you come across this stuff in what you do?
Actually, no, I don't. First of all, John, very insightful. But no, I don't come across it a whole lot. However, it is it is quite an interesting topic. Especially, I was looking at a publication yesterday showing that there's over $2 trillion of trade finance that happened in 2022, and that's up by 22% year on year. So the flow of goods internationally, I think, is very, very important. However, when we see letters of credit, all I've heard are horror stories that if you get so much as if you get a 4 mixed up with an A, then you're not going to get paid, and your goods can sit on the dock for months. So just to get it would be good, just as part of the library here, Mark, within the organization that we have here in Callisto, to get an idea of what it looks like, even at a high level, so at least we can see what these moving parts are.
I think that's kind of a lot of how kind of trade tech came about, wasn't it? Like you were saying, Brad, there were that thing you said, there's a full stop in the wrong place, or an apostrophe, or someone spilt their tea or whatever on the letter of credit, and it all goes to pot, and you can't get your money. Yeah, so I guess that was part of the reason why trade tech came about, was to simplify and standardize, and because I think a lot of the letter of credit stuff is now kind of online in templates. Yeah, so it takes out some of the variation. Is that right, John?
Yeah, I mean, it can be, but I think there's a few things to say on this. Firstly, there's the horror statistic, and the horror statistic is, and you see different variations of this, but something like between 50 and 70% of all presentations to banks under letters of credit fail on first presentation due to errors in the document.
Purely down to admin.
And that's horrific. And frustratingly, the errors can be very, very small. It's down to lack of attention to details to this. If you look at the letter of credit regulations, there are two basic sets of regulations. There's UCP 600, which, if you like, is the rule book for letters of credit. And there's another set of rules called ISBP, International Standard Banking Practice. So, you're right. I'm sorry, I didn't get the last speaker's name. Please forgive me for that. Brad. But, when you say you don't get paid if a full stop's in the wrong place and there's a spelling mistake, it's absolutely true that there is a rule of strict compliance. Documents have to strictly comply with the terms and conditions of the letter of credit. But if you look, and that's absolutely correct, if you look at international standard banking practice, it will state that banks may not reject documents due to spelling mistakes or due to wrong wrong punctuation marks. They're not allowed to do that unless the mistake changes the meaning of the word or the sentence in which that word appears. So I think the true thing to say is that, there's quite, you have to be accurate with letters of credit. And, it's not something that you can bluff about. It requires training. And, in trade technologies, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that, we get the documents right. We ensure compliant documents are presented, because this, it's a scary statistic, 50 to 70% of failure on first presentation. And of course, ultimately, the exporter will probably get paid in most cases, but the payment is at risk if the documents are incorrect. And of course, the big thing is it's going to delay payment, and that's bad for cash flow. So really important to get it right. And you're absolutely right, Mark. That's why the trade tech solution came into being, to support exporters in getting the documentation right, presenting compliant documents using our system, and getting paid on time.
Okay, so we got there's a good point made here, and it kind of correlates with something I was going to ask as well, and it's very pertinent, I guess, to us all in Europe. The Incoterms are very definite about when risk passes from point A to point B. On a taking reality into account now, and something that Jim Adams mentioned as well, talking about letters of credit, but with Incoterms too. In wartime situations, how does it all work then? Is there like some kind of force majeure exemption, or because I'm thinking, obviously the Ukraine situation, has there been an upturn in change of trends around various different things because of what's going on there and moving goods into the rest of Europe or into the Ukraine, for example?
That's really interesting, and of course it is very, very topical. The reality, and actually it's quite interesting, because I've been advising a client on movement of goods movement of reconstruction Russian goods into Ukraine. And actually, you know, the key thing to remember is as long as the contract is under an EF or C term, it's absolutely fine because risk ends on dispatch, not on arrival in the conflict zone. You know, what we would always say is if you're selling to a conflict zone, I mean, you know, frankly, from an exporter's point of view, the D Incoterms, think of the word D as dangerous. You know, it doesn't, that's not what it means. It means delivered. D stands for delivered. Okay. But I always think of D as dangerous and DDP as deadly dangerous practice, as the most dangerous terms from the seller's point of view. So if you're selling into a conflict zone, it'd be really dangerous to use a D term.
Okay, there's a question come up here which is very dear to my heart and something I bleat about every time I do a training when we do our training. Question is from David. Is there a change to how companies are using Incoterms due to Brexit? What were the major implications to freight coming in and out of the UK with relation to Incoterms?
Yeah, thanks, David. I don't think there's a change in the terms that are being used because it doesn't need one. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're selling within a customs union or outside a customs union, it doesn't matter. So I don't think there are really any changes. I guess the only thing I would say is, of course, whereas within the customs union, so for example, when the UK was part of the European Union, it would be okay for the a UK seller to sell to a buyer in France, X works, because that, you know, the VAT implication is handled by Intrastat. Now that the UK has left the European Union, it would be impossible to, well, it wouldn't be wise to use X works because then VAT would have to be charged. So that's the only real thing, I think. Otherwise, no real difference. There's no real need for any difference after leaving the customs union.
So, but I'm more, we see all these news stories, you know, of lorries backing up in Calais and so on, or the other way. Is there more, has there been kind of a lot of businesses coming to the likes of yourselves and, you know, asking, are we doing everything right now? You know, is our documentation correct? Are we using the right terms to get stuff into France and things that were kind of taken for granted, you know, a few years ago?
From a customs perspective, yes. Because of course, for the first time, you know, what we have here in the UK is we have a number of companies who previously had only ever sold within the European Union. They've never sold outside a customs union. And of course, you know, when you're buying and selling within a customs union, within the EU, there's no customs declarations, there's no customs interventions. Suddenly they found they have to make customs declarations. They've never done it before. They don't know how to do it. They don't know the implications. They don't know how to use customs procedure codes. They're not sure about their HS codes and so on and so on. So I think, you know, the issues hasn't really been relating to Incoterms. It's been more related to customs responsibilities. Now we're not part of the European Union. Companies in the UK that also sold outside the EU, they haven't had a problem because, you know, they're used to doing customs declarations. But those who only ever sold within the European Union, suddenly they're finding they had to do new things. And actually, the Institute of Export has set up, on behalf of HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the Institute of Export has actually set up a helpline. They're contracted to do that, to help particularly SME exporters and importers handle customs declarations.
That's one of the first few times I've heard people say His Majesty.
So I think that's where the problem is.
Okay.
Yeah,
kind of His Majesty. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the other things we were talking about when we were prepping up last week and kind of bringing high radius into this, or technology in general, was you know, the Incoterms are somewhere in the customer master data files. Yeah, so it's, you know, it'll be there as part of pricing and products and qualities and, you know, colors and whatever else of, you know, all the other things that make up the master data file. So I'm thinking, you know, practically, I think it would be, and everybody who's, you know, party to this and to share it with other people as well, really, that when you're exporting your kind of receivables information, because we have payment terms, payment methods, all these other things that we export into Excel or whatever else, to actually kind of add this field on as well and to review the Incoterms that apply. I think this would be very good information, when it comes to getting to know your customer and to expand our kind of horizons of what's going on contractually. So I think that's where technology can help in this area as well. Very simple thing, just find that field and have it brought into the into the aging reports and things like that.
Yeah,
so that's our tip.
Well, and absolutely agree with that, Mark. And I think the thing is that to allow flexibility, because the Incoterm used for a contract may vary from time to time. It's not going to be the same for the same customer every time. A lot would depend on the risk appetite of the parties. A lot would depend on who can get the best freight rate. If the buyer can get the best freight rate at a particular time, it would make sense for the sale to be under an F Incoterm where the buyer arranges the freight. If the seller can get the best freight rate, it makes sense it should be under a C group Incoterm. Or dare I say, it's a D group term. So, it needs to be flexibility, because the term which is going to apply to a contract won't necessarily be the same all the time. So for example, you can have 10 customers in one country, and between them there may be 4 or 5 different terms that they want to use.
You were saying about the who can get the best freight rate, right? And we've noticed over the last, pretty well since the COVID time, so what, 3 years now, that the cost of containers themselves at one point kind of went up from I think it was an average of $2,000 per container to like 20,000, and they come down again now. So is there some kind of kind of debate going on between buyer and seller as to what the terms would be? Because like you said, if someone's having to bear the cost of this, that this has some significance. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, it is, Mark. I mean, at the end of the day, the buyer pays for everything anyway. It's just a question of who prepays it. Does the seller prepay the freight, or will the buyer pay the freight directly to the shipping line or the airline? So the buyer's going to pay for it eventually anyway. There's no question about that. But yeah, there's been huge turbulence in freight rates. I mean, as you say, they are normalizing now. Container shipments particularly, there was a big container imbalance. The empty containers weren't in the right places, and because of that, freight rate shot up for containerized sea freight, and also for air freight as well. During COVID, most air freight, of course, is carried in passenger aircraft, in the belly hold of passenger aircraft. During COVID, there weren't that many flights going, so the air freight costs just shot up incredibly. And again, air freight rates have only started to normalize. And both air freight and sea freight, they will come back to normal, probably not till next year, but the movement is in the right direction. But I think it's always important to recognize that at the end of the day, the buyer pays for everything anyway. It just depends on which party can get the best deal from the carrier at any one particular time.
Okay, because we discussed this in terms of kind of profit margins and things like that. So it obviously had a huge impact on companies' profit margins, all these increase of prices. It's interesting, all this is going on in the background. And so does this mean that also brokers and so on have also kind of, there's been an increase in work for brokers, where maybe it was done before COVID, companies will sort out their own or have standard partners. So as brokers had a bigger role to play in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A good freight broker, a good freight forwarder, should be able to get a better freight rate because they've got the economy of scale. For example, if the exporter is exporting 50 containers a year, then they can get a certain freight rate based on 50 containers a year. But the freight forwarder is hopefully handling, 5,000 containers a year. They should be able to get a much better deal from the carrier. So as long as they pass on that saving, of course, they need to make money as well. So there'll be an agency charge. But I think now it probably is more generally recognized that freight brokers and freight forwarders if they're doing their job properly, they should be able to get better deals from the carriers. Absolutely. Okay.
Got a good question here coming from Alexei. I know he's up there in Prague. Question is, we guess Incoterms, 2010 Incoterms are still widely used. And so many contracts, well, basically, I think the question is, are contracts under the 2010 Incoterms still valid, even though they've now been renewed in 2020? Or is everything transferred to 2020 terms?
It depends entirely on what the contract says. You know, the reality, again, very interesting question, Alexei, thank you. The reality is, if both parties, if the seller and buyer agree, you can use whatever version you like. If you want to use the first version Incoterms 1936, if you can find a copy of the book, and your contract is subject to Incoterms 1936, that's absolutely fine. If the contract just says Incoterms and nothing else, if there's a dispute and it went to a court, the judge would take it as being the current version, which is Incoterms 2020. I think an important thing to remember is that, you know, as I say, I've been involved in the last 3 reviews of Incoterms, and the whole reason Incoterms get reviewed, normally every 10 years, is because things change in the way international trade is conducted. So if you're using an old version, the danger is that it may reflect the old-fashioned way of doing things, which no longer happens, and that can lead to a gap. So the recommendation is to use the current version, Incoterms 2020. But if your contract says Incoterms 2010, and you know that contract hasn't been amended, and your buyer's still happy with Incoterms 2010, nothing wrong with that at all. You can still use Incoterms 2010. But as I say, you know, good practice is to use the current version. But always remember, in contracts, you must state the version that the contract is on.
We're down to the last 3 minutes.
If you just state Incoterms, as I've said, it will be deemed to be the current version.
Okay, so we're down to our last 3 minutes or so now. So we're just kind of get into it. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thanks very much indeed. Have there been any famous cases? A few weeks ago, I watched the Tom Hanks movie Captain Phillips, where there was the piracy off Somalia and all that kind of stuff, you know. And I was just thinking, have there been any famous cases that we'd all kind of recognize? Maybe that was one of them, you know, where these things, even though they're not going to make a movie out of Incoterms, I don't think, but somebody's just said best movie ever. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so yeah, any famous cases where it's been really Incoterms have really been significant?
Well, I think, you know, the case I'm going to quote is actually something that happened quite recently, and it underlines why it's important to use the right term. And I'm going to have to be really quick here, I know. But the case was actually a UK importer imported some high-value goods into the UK. The goods were in containers, and they used CIF. And of course, because the goods were in containers, it shouldn't have been CIF. It should have been CIP. Anyway, there was an insurance claim, and the insurance claim was £1.5 million. They were high value goods. So insurance claim for £1.5 million from the buyer. And the insurance company said, we're not paying the claim because you put CIF, the goods are in containers, it should have been CIP, and therefore we will not pay the insurance claim. So that was a £1.5 million loss to the company. So I think from my point of view, it may not be that case may not be that famous, apart from, you know, those of us who teach Incoterms. It's become very famous to us. I think we could do a good movie about that, because actually, strangely, the story was the goods were damaged because the lorries carrying the containers to the end user crashed into 3 bridges on the A11. Both lorries each crashed into 3 bridges on the A11 going into Essex. So there we go. I haven't got time to tell you the full story, but I think I can make a really good movie out of that one.
Okay, well, you're giving us ideas for things to do at our conference in October. Excellent, thank you. So anybody else want to add anything? We got 1 minute left. Anybody else want to add any comments? I'm glad a few people like the Captain Phillips movie, so thank you for that. So anything anybody else would like to add before we wind up? So, okay. Well, I think one thing I would say, we've actually had a record attendance today. Esty, how many people actually joined us today?
89 at the top.
89.
Mhm.
Wow, that's amazing. So thank you very much, everybody. We're a big round of applause to you all. We're honored that you've all put yourself out at different times of the day. I know some of you are still in bed watching in your pajamas and so on. So, but thank you all for about 89 people. That's amazing. So thanks a lot. So we are back again. We're back again on March the 8th. We'll let you know what the subject's going to be very soon. In the meantime, really just thank you all for coming. John, that's been an amazing hour. Thank you so much indeed for helping us prepare it. I know it wasn't just the hour today. We spent quite a bit of time putting it together in the last couple of weeks. So thank you for that. Hannah and High Radius, thank you always for supporting us. Yeah, SD, Sadia and the team bringing it all together. Thanks very much. So we're done. Time's up. Stay in touch. Anything else you want to talk about, keep firing comments through. If not, we'll see you soon. Take care. Stay safe. God bless. And thank you all. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Until
Well,
next
thanks,
time.
John.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone. It's been
you.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks for organising, Mark. Bye now.
Oh, have a drink of water. Mm-hmm. All right. Okie dokie. Okay, just a couple of people to sign off. So, did John go? Okay, we'll catch up with him later. All right.